Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Unleashing the Power of AI in Biotech, 5 Actionable Insights from Ganymede, Snthesis, and SciNote. My name is Brendan McCorkle. I'm the CEO of SciNote, an electronic lab notebook vendor, and I'll be your host for today's event. This webinar is presented by LabRoots and brought to you by SciNote. To learn more about SciNote, please visit www.scinote.net, SCINOTE.net. We encourage you to participate today by submitting any questions you may have. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Send. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. Finally, we have a few questions to ask you, the audience, about your take on AI and its impact on the biotech industry. Please take a moment to answer those questions, and we will share results in our follow-up emails. I would now like to welcome our speakers. Please join me in welcoming Nathan Clark, CEO and co-founder of Ganymede, and Emerson Huitt, CEO and founder of Snthesis. For complete biographies on our speakers, please visit the Biography tab at the top of your screen. To kick things off, maybe we'll ask Nathan first here. How can biotech companies conceptually wrap their heads around AI and/or ML? What types of impact can they expect?
Absolutely. And that's a very broad question, so I'll try to give some high-level thoughts and then narrow it in. But ultimately, the way that a handy way for thinking about AI is the idea that it's effectively a very, very complex statistical model. It's self-assembling in terms of the parameters that are set in that model. But you can almost always, whenever you're saying AI, you can replace it with the concept of more traditional statistics and use that to derive insights of where it can be applied. And what has really driven the AI revolution in the last few years is the copious volumes of data that drive that. So in the lens of AI being the bleeding edge of statistics, that's one of the ways that informs how we see AI being used effectively in the wet lab is larger and larger volumes of data being created than ever before, greater and greater computing power being brought to the fore. And then AI ultimately is more of applying a mathematical approach and a statistical approach to developing ways to leverage that data in ways that are almost hard for humans to comprehend, but are ultimately effectively configurations of a statistical model. So you see that from early stage drug discovery where larger and larger omics data volumes can drive the data scale that's required to start doing large scale AI. You see that later stage where people are capturing in their manufacturing process or their process development more and more data than ever before and structuring it in a more rigorous way. That also drives the ability to create AI on top of it, where in the past, people might not have been able to even do simple statistical models, both because the data scale was too low or even they weren't capturing the data at all. So it's a harmonious synergistic process, the development of data, the structuring of data, and the evolution of AI models in the market. That's driving a lot of excitement right now. And the future looks very bright for where this is all heading.
Wonderful. I know a lot of our attendees are looking for examples of applications that leverage these two. We spend a lot of time internally talking about the ML side of this equation being very tightly mapped to search, as if AI was very tightly mapped to doing stats. So an example here would be if we have a large lab or a company that has multiple sites or even collaborating with peers of theirs in the industry, the number of protocols run in their experiments may be in the thousands. So actually verifying whether a protocol has been done before, is anybody working on something similar? Can I replicate work of one of my colleagues? Or I'm thinking of a new experiment. Can I pull out something that's nearby to what I'm thinking? The tech that we're building to answer these types of use cases is much more ML than AI on the spectrum. Emerson, I know you're maybe even a step closer to the business unit at Snthesis. Would love a sense of an example or two, maybe something that is true and proper AI, and maybe even something that people think is AI but isn't really. Might be fun.
Absolutely, and I would definitely echo that AI is something that you can look at as a statistical process that can help you find patterns in large data sets. Nathan, the point you made about being able to do interesting omics analyses across really, really large data sets is one that I think is going to have a lot of impact in the biotech space in the near future. Already we're seeing AI tools, models like AlphaFold, for instance, that are being made available for research applications that can do things that traditional computational tools can't, like protein structure prediction in a well-validated model is something that is beyond the reach of most biotech companies to train, but having those models available for research usage from companies like DeepMind, I think is going to be really transformative in allowing companies to do novel work with the data that they've generated. We have a number of customers in the immuno-oncology and agricultural biotech space, for instance, that are leveraging AlphaFold specifically right now to enhance their discovery pipelines by doing in silico structure prediction and piping that data into other computational chemistry tools to do a lot of in silico work to really narrow their pipelines and improve their efficiency in their pipelines. And then kind of at the other end of the spectrum, something that is more an ML model, we have a customer right now that has leveraged data that they've collected, a well-integrated and well-labeled data set that they've collected over the past 7 years or so of bacterial isolation in the microbiomic space, where they've been very judicious about collecting both the operational data, things like lab environment and equipment parameters, as well as human-labeled or collected metadata about bacterial growth, as well as images of each time they do a microbial isolation. And so they've built an ML model around that to optimize their selection of bacterial colonies, which is something that's really transformative in their workflow, but is really, going back to your point, Nathan, just a statistical model that's saying you should pick this thing over that thing. So not true AI, but I think that area where you're looking at AI and ML as an assistive technology is really going to be transformative in the biotech landscape. And if you're a biotech executive on this call, you can look at it like this. AI is not going to put you out of business, but the companies that are using AI to go faster than you are will certainly have a market advantage over you.
Well said. I think there's a lot of noise in the market about AI and the fear, but hopefully we bring a little bit of the power and lower the fear today. So the next topic to talk a little bit about is sort of the role of data in biotech research. So I'm going to take the first swing at this, and then I'd love input from both of you guys. So, for us, we're in an interesting seat because we're part of the capture of the data for the consumption a little bit later down the flow. And even folks like Ganymede maybe are either an additional sort of capture or a branching point to a whole bunch of other sources of data, machine and system. So as labs are becoming more digital, the volume of the data, Emerson talked about images, right? So big binary files take a whole set of computational resources to deal with in a way that text doesn't. But this also is multiplicative if you have a bunch of different sources. So you have someone using an ELN, maybe you're using 3 or 4 different LIMS systems. You have things entered from machines, maybe you have some things manually entered from machines that are not software enabled. All of these pull together with different formats, with different consistency and accuracy. We're pretty guilty about making this problem worse before we make it better. We allow people to do fully unstructured data, which is maybe the worst for the other end of the pipeline. And so what's important here is, just like in healthcare, every one of these edges is a place for data fidelity to go down. Every one that's not stitched into the picture, every machine that's not connected, every note that doesn't make it into the data set for the AI consumption will lower the quality of that analysis. So I think that there's sort of 2 axes here, and each of us feel one of them a little more than the other ones. But for us, maybe disproportionately, and Nathan may be on our team on this one, it's actually the fidelity of the data at the beginning of the funnel. Do we have all of the data sources in? Are they in a place that can be accessed? If they're fully unstructured like binaries, do we have anything around them? Some metadata, some tagging, consistent headers, any sort of reason that we can put on top of them before we hand them down the line. So maybe I'll pass to Nathan for this, because I think we're on team get all the data, and then we'll pass back to Emerson, who's team shape up that data. Nathan, how do you feel about the role of data in research?
Yeah, 100% team get all the data. I think for us, a heuristic that we think in terms of for getting your data and your platform and your business AI ready is the volume of data that you have sort of multiplied by the structure and contextualization of that data, the usefulness and structure of that data. And you can see this in other industries that are much more automated and further along, because by their nature, industries like finance, advertising, those sorts of things with very human designed data, it's much easier, of course, than in biology to get large data sets, to structure them in a way that makes sense. But what AI has really, those industries leverage AI to the point that it's not even innovation anymore. It's just table stakes. If you start a financial company, you can't not have some level of AI operating in your credit underwriting process or something. And that's because you have these huge billion record data sets that are also very well structured, very well contextualized. And I think that is something that people naturally realize is valuable, AI or not. And because, especially in the larger pharmas in the last decade or so, there's been an initiative to do digital transformation, that's excellent, because that makes it so that companies are a little bit more geared already towards being AI ready. But you can really never be enough of a data gatherer. You can never have enough data because a lot of the value of AI in ML approaches is being able to discover those hidden signals. It is just a statistical model, but it's a very, very complex one. It's a super advanced one, and it's somewhat self-assembling in that it's going to figure out the signals that matter rather than you having to tell it in many ways, in a broad sense. And so when you can give it more data, it's going to be able to find more insights that you might not even have thought of. So 100% on team, get all the data. And I think that is something that's virtuous for AI. That's something that's virtuous for the business in general, for any sort of operations. And so it all goes hand in hand. I feel like it's kind of similar to the revolutions of mainframes in the 60s, and then personal computers and spreadsheets in the 80s and 90s, and then business applications and IT teams who are writing code in the 2000s. It's hard to exactly, in Emerson's example, those things in and of themselves won't put you out of business, but the other companies that are using them might move faster than you, and it becomes noticeable. And it's hard to pin down exactly where it is, but suddenly everyone seems 1.25x more productive at the other company, and that can be a market changer.
And just to chime in, actually, I am also 100% on team get all of the data as well.
Look at the unity.
Exactly. AI is really driven by the amount of data you have, and the more data that you can put towards a custom AI project that is going to enhance something about your business, whether that's building a model to accelerate a particular assay or optimizing a process that you have internally, the more data that you can give those projects, the better the outcomes are going to be. I mean, if you look at large language models, they're trained on billions or tens of billions, and in the very near future, hundreds of billions of parameters. Obviously, a lot of times those sorts of training sets are out of the reach of something like an assay project. But if you're looking at large-scale omics, that level of parameters is something that's approachable now for larger companies. And when you're building out AI models internally, you get out what you put in. So having a high-quality, well-curated data set is absolutely critical to leveraging AI on your data. So get all of the data you can. Storage is cheap, even if it's large binaries like images that you don't know if you're going to use. Capture those images and store them, and make sure that they are associated with the metadata that a human is generating related to those images. Like if you're doing microscopy and someone is capturing metadata, hopefully in a structured system or even in an unstructured format, make sure that you can link those two things up down the road, because you don't know what's going to be valuable 2 years or 5 years from now. And the landscape for publicly available kind of foundational models that can be pretty easily pulled into a pipeline to build something that might add significant business value is growing at a pretty exponential rate right now. So spending time internally thinking about what data you might capture, what data you're not capturing, and how to put it all together is one of the most valuable things you can do to make yourself AI ready.
So this bridges really nicely into our next question that I'll stay with you first, Emerson, here. As this volume goes up, What strategies can biotech companies employ to sort of either ensure or feel comfortable about data quality and integrity, especially as we're moving towards data that's processed by AI algorithms?
That's a really great question, and it does dovetail really nicely into that discussion. The most important thing you can do is to know what you're capturing and why it matters. So write down a data model. A lot of companies, especially in the early stage of research, don't necessarily write down their data model or only record parts of it and then leave things like individual assays up to the scientists running those assays, which works okay in terms of delivering immediate research outcomes, but makes it very difficult to do trend analysis across assays or retrospective analysis across your entire business. So taking the time to write down a data model and what data is validated and how that data needs to be validated is something that's mission critical. I would also say that automating the capture of data wherever possible, whether that's just getting large binary files like images off the instrument machines and into some kind of management system, is critical, even if that's like in a notebook entry where there are unstructured notes about that data. That's better than having it sitting on a hard drive somewhere where it's not accessible to a future data science team. And then I would say use a structured data capture system for manual metadata as much as you can. That could even be something like a spreadsheet, as long as you are validating that in some way and aggregating it into a data set that somebody can look at in aggregate. And validate how data connects to one another, whether that's the metadata related to an image file or metadata about the sequence file. Validate that you can actually connect those pieces of data together so that in the future, if you discover that there's some interesting AI application you might layer on top of that data, you don't have to spend a lot of effort cleaning it.
I'm smiling here because maybe here's where we draw the front line in our teams, not the other one. And maybe this is just the vendor guilt for being an unstructured data capture source, that we know that we have work to do on this front here. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about data readiness. And so, this sort of preparation of the data to hand further down this pipeline from the bench, or even from the machine on the bench and the scientist at the bench further towards the data science team. And we've opened up this front, and a lot of our peers in ELN have opened up this front of being fully unstructured, which is maybe the worst nightmare for the data team. So if we're starting with low data readiness, for us, what we're trying to pick is the places where we can insulate the easy misses on this. So some examples of this might be not allowing somebody to enter a negative distance or a negative weight. This is not going to limit creativity. And this is where I think this tension is going to live far longer than this conversation, because at the bench, at the unit of the scientist, the harder the boundaries are and the closer the boundaries are to complete structure, you start limiting creativity. And we think creativity maps to the R in R&D. So we want to try to we talk about having the most flexibility we can, as opposed to complete flexibility, because we want to make sure that we're not gleefully and willingly passing these negative distances and weights down to the data science team, or not having consistent headers. We can know with a very light touch of ML that a t-test with 2 lowercase t's, no space, one with a space, one with 2 capital T's, one with a hyphen, are all the same damn thing. And we can normalize them and take this out of the noise later, while saying the scientist can answer whatever the hell. We know that that's a t-test. That's an example of like this light structure that has sort of leverage down the line. The other piece of it, I think we've already talked about, is trying to make sure that the pieces that are harder are at least logged somewhere. A picture of a weight on the scale is now a binary. We have systems to pull in binaries. We can at least log who it was, when it was, right? And if it's clean enough on a PDF, maybe we can do some OCR and even do something fancier than just logging it. What else do you think of when it comes to data readiness, as we sort of take it to this stage and then throw it over to you, Emerson, or actually maybe Nathan, since Emerson just answered. What else do you think about data readiness before we bundle it up and pass it down the line towards the data science team?
Sure. Yeah. And there's been a lot of great points made, which I think sketch out the fact that data readiness to us is really an organization-wide thing that has to be something that the whole business has to be invested in. At that level, I think, as Emerson was implying, the data model, that's an important key part. And I think that's that half of part of it is getting lots of data, and then the other half is structuring it, contextualizing it, giving a rich model. Having both the tools in place, tools like Snthesis to help with that, but also having the people in place, I think, are critical. I think we already see with our clients a pretty big divergence between clients where, once you get into the hundreds of people, do you have someone who's in charge of the data model? Do you have a data governance person? Do you have an informatics person? Someone who's working to bridge the business and the systems and say, okay, this is my data structure that I care about. Here's why. And I think that's where a lot of the success from AI and ML projects is partly in the model, but also partly in the business transformation that people go through to get there. Because when you're talking about, for instance, you will need large scales of data to actually leverage a model. But even if you apply this approach to lower scale things like automating assays or automating data capture, still you'll get dividends from being able to do simple statistics or even just having the data available and contextualized. So I think that human element is important. Another big element also, I think, is thinking in an agile way for what the value that your data will bring is. So one of the problems I think that people oftentimes get wrapped up in when they try to approach AI projects is that they have some extremely grand vision, which is great, but it can be risky to undertake something that broad when the value might not play out for years down the road. Critical also to do those smaller projects and have a broad-based way to get lots of your data online and structured so that you're delivering smaller chunks of value early and quickly without the overhead of having to build the world's perfect model. I think that's another aspect of what I would call data readiness, is just being realistic about the value that you expect to get out of this and having a clear line of sight to say, okay, this is what I think I'll get out of the data readiness. And it's 100% there. It's very big and very real, but it requires a fair amount of work to think through and to kind of figure out the question that you want to ask of your data in advance. So I think those are many of the aspects to us which are not the data itself, because of course you want fair data, of course you want lots of it. And we can't say that enough, but I think that the framework around it on the organizational side is also quite key.
I couldn't agree more with that, Nathan. I think the cultural side of data readiness gets overlooked a lot in terms of building a culture of accountability for data and also fostering a culture of creativity with your data, where a data model is seen as something that evolves over time rather than a hard line in the sand. Brendan, I really couldn't agree more about the need for flexibility, especially when you get down to early stage discovery at the bench, allowing scientists to have the flexibility to capture what they're doing that day, which may be driven by something they read in a paper yesterday or some insight they had, rather than rigid adherence to a structured data model is absolutely the way to go. And I think overly structuring data when you're ingesting it is one of the most common reasons for software implementation failures in the biotech space, because the scientists can't capture the information that's really important. And this is, I think, the area where AI tools actually have the potential to have the most short-term impact for scientists, is in allowing the reduction of friction between scientists doing discovery and later stages in the pipeline. So leveraging AI to do exactly the sorts of things that you were talking about, where we know that t-test with undercase t's is the same as t-test with capital T, and things of that nature, where we can automatically integrate data columns, and also going back to unstructured data later when your data model has evolved and saying, we need to pull out, like, for instance, selection agents that were used during a particular stage in the assay and be able to look at that in aggregate. Using AI models that are pretty much off the shelf today, it's very easy to do that sort of thing. And leveraging a tool like Snthesis to allow you to layer whatever data model you want to answer a particular question on top of a pool of unstructured data can really reduce that friction.
I couldn't agree more. I think that maybe doing one layer deeper into this particular issue and making this practical, I'd love for all of us to go and talk about maybe a specific use case that was unlocked by AI at one of our customers. So I'll go first and bridge from sort of data readiness, because I think actually one of the ones I think is the coolest in our user base is an implementation that actually enabled the data group at the customer at all. So I think this is sort of a gate opening, and then you guys can maybe come up with solutions that are a little further into market. So we work with a company in Boston that works on microRNA solutions, and so they have a fantastic amount of data and big images, right? They're doing petabytes of data a day, and so they have the pain of proper big data just in regular analysis, but they also have wet lab scientists who are doing experiments and creating new data. And the scientists wanted to use something like an ELN or ELN plus a couple other pieces of software in the bench. And the CTO, who was responsible for building the data team, and most of their actual business was the output of their data insights to their customers. And these pieces didn't fit together, right? So the piece that and ultimately bridged them, which was cool, was actually having this blend of the sort of most flexible possible with a very light layer of translation on the other side. And so we sort of bounded the workspace for the bench scientist to be able to pull in this other sort of data, or actually not sometimes when it's that big, but play nicely so that the data could be stitched together, and actually remove the barrier of the CTO saying, no ELN. If we have an ELN, we're not going to be able to do data science. So obviously, as an ELN vendor, this one is near and dear to my heart. But this was a use case where the two pieces of software or the two workflows were seen as so incompatible that they couldn't actually pick a tool at the bench that the scientists wanted to use. And they actually started using us and pulled into their workflows. And now with some of that really light mapping, they not only launched the data science team, they've actually been able to do this sort of virtuous loop where they're normalizing on headers, and then it gets a little easier, and then finding other insights or metadata that they should add to their binaries. And this is sort of first unblocking their data science team, but then starting to be, much like in software development, they kind of have almost this agile process going, and it's getting better and quicker and higher fidelity of the data as they go, which has been really, really cool to watch. So for you guys, maybe Nathan, any favorite insights or breakthroughs from your user base that is in this AI ML only possible because of this type of technology?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say there's kind of two cases that we see. One is the very, very high scale early R&D stuff. And I won't go too deep into that, but I love that we get to work with some people that are doing incredible, petabytes of data that they're churning through. They have their own custom infrastructure that they built out, and it works for them, and it generates pipelines very quickly. But actually, the example I wanted to pick up on as sort of a later stage example of some of this that associates the data with the modeling is we were working with a client that was doing some in vivo work, and they were preparing a bunch of doing very multiplexed plate preparations, but for in vivo purposes, and not in a way that could really easily be automated with a liquid handler. So they had a CRO, or kind of CRO CDMO, preparing these for them en masse, and they were trying to work on the tech transfer into that CRO. And they could not get it to work reliably, and they couldn't understand. And one of the things that we had been doing is starting to ingest some of their data and actually parsing out PDFs and Word documents that they were getting out of the CRO. And we were taking a lot of that and structuring it and filling out certain fields and putting it into their LIMS system for them automatically. But the other thing that we were doing at the same time was just parsing out everything from the PDF and then sort of saving that and saying, okay, let's also keep the whole parsed PDF and see maybe eventually that can be useful. And indeed, one of the things when we started really looking into this and running some models on it, we noticed that, so the PDF includes the scientist on the CRO side in their name who had been doing it. And that was not something that they had anticipated caring about in their data model. Like the whole point of a CRO is you shouldn't have to care about what's happening inside in theory. Of course, in practice, it's very collaborative. But it turned out some of the scientists are just very bad at pipetting, and some of them are very good at pipetting, and some of them are very inaccurate, and that was very sensitive to them. And so that's a case where we weren't trying to, that was not something that we even had in our approach that we were trying to capture intentionally, but by having the data there and having a way to go look at it and run some basic modeling on it, we were able to notice that and say, hey, maybe you should actually investigate the quality of some of the scientists in there pipetting there. And that improved things significantly. So I think it also is one of those things where by stabilizing some of the data, I love the idea of using AI for QC sort of use cases in general, or outlier detection, because that's where it's great. You're not assuming that there's extra context that you might be missing. The whole point of QC is you're evaluating it against sort of its own, the data set in place, and you sort of know what you're looking for. and you just want to find what's the signal or what's going wrong, that's where it's actually a very powerful case. And I think it goes really hand in hand with the idea of automation and better data capture in compliance going together in one thing, reducing some of that manual data entry burden that you mentioned.
I love this. In healthcare, there's a phlebotomy team in the hospital. There's sort of implicit acknowledgement that some skills are harder than others. And so people who are good at them do them and others don't. And they can still have a very powerful, collaborative, and professionally trained team. So maybe that's our nugget of food for thought in the future, whether we'll be seeing, pipette teams like phlebotomy teams or whether the automated pipetters will do better than all of us. So there's an interesting thought for us to take home. Emerson, any favorite impact of AI on an industry use case?
Absolutely, and I think mine kind of bridges the gap between the two that you both gave. We have a customer who has been doing microbiomics discovery in the healthcare space for about actually, they've been doing it for about 10 years, but when we went in, they had about 7 years of assay data that was across a number of indications, all in Excel files that had been generated by about 40 different scientists. So as you can imagine, it was kind of a mess of data, and they were only looking at the data for individual targets of interest that were moving into development phases, not looking at the data in aggregate, because it was just this giant corpus of Excel files that nobody really had a map to. So we were able to run our software over that data, extract the common fields, give them a suggested data model, and then do a lot of outlier detection, like where were there additional data points that people had captured about experiments that stuck out, what were those sorts of things, and provide them with a data set from this assay corpus, as well as enable them to continue doing these assays in Excel files while integrating them into their ELN tool. They were using an ELN that's not as flexible as SciNote, unfortunately. So they kept all of this assay work outside of the ELN, thinking that there was no way to allow the flexibility that they needed for the assay scientists and capture it in a structured way. So we were able to bridge that gap and give them a continual flow of ongoing data, as well as integrate all of their historical data. And then the ML win came from their data science team suddenly having access to the entire corpus of assay data across all of the indications that they were interested in, and being able to develop some more classical statistical models based on that to dramatically improve their target selection rate. So they were able to improve their hit rate in their assays using these very traditional ML statistical model approaches, from having this huge corpus of data suddenly by a factor of 10, which was really impactful. That's the kind of science that I like to see, where you can give people data that they never thought they would have access to, and suddenly they're able to do something that really impacts the bottom line of their research.
Yes, that is really, really cool. All right, keeping an eye on the time here, I think maybe one more before we move to some questions from our audience here. I think it would be good to step through sort of trends we see looking forward. So I can sort of take two that we bump into a lot. One of them, I think, is a lot like you were just mentioning, Emerson, that this sort of I'll call it magic, but it's really the usability that comes from having generated structure, very light generated structure on top of stuff that's unstructured. And I think that, you all have been listening to us talk about data models and all of these things that may be part of the reason why people are leaning back from AI, is that it feels very technical and it feels very heady, right? So one of the things that I think is happening in AI, and will continue to happen, is the beginning to abstract away the actual implementation of some of the harder parts of this. So the more that some of these models can be suggested, or things can be pulled out of the model as a recommendation, and this is really the generative part, right? It's a combination of the generative part, or maybe easing search as well. This is something that's just immediately lowers the bar to entry for somebody doing data science at all, or to do a more complex query, or to stitch together pieces of data that they couldn't even believe could be put into the same place. So I think that this is sort of one trend I see, is just this bar slowly lowering. this bar, sort of once it's low enough, I think we'll very soon start to see more and more tooling that's available on top of it, where your average scientist will be able to do things. We talk about the t-test just because it's easy, but even going a little further into data science as a non-data scientist. And this is another really interesting place on research, is the power downstream of higher fidelity data and more of it, but also the power downstream if the closer that the analysis can happen to the data. If the bench scientists can do a little bit of data science, they also have all the context that's not in the system. And we're probably going to be in a world where, as much as we like to think we can stitch together perfect data, there's still going to be something in the scientist's head, or in a an article that they read that morning, I think we mentioned, that inspired them to run a version of a test. So the ability to have the calculations done basically as close to that moment and as close to that brain as possible is a really, really powerful thing. And the more non-professional data science tooling comes, this distance can shrink. So I think this will continue to shrink, which is one. The other one I see being really powerful in life sciences is that, ChatGPT and public models, public LLMs have really been sharing and stealing the spotlight lately. But I think we're going to start to see vertically targeted models become more and more of a thing. And I think this is a place of fear that is transient for biotech R&D, where, actually think about the PDFs or the Excel files that Emerson was talking about. Having these be the input to a model that actually stays behind your corporate walls the whole time. You're not exposing this data to anybody else. You're not exposing it to industry. You don't really need to ingest stuff from outside because you're doing research after the corpus of the last 20 years that you already have, or 30 years that you already have. This is what feeds the model, and you need it to stay inside. I think we'll see more of these, biotech specific, and I think this will pair with closed or private. Whether they're open source or not is a go-to-market motion, but the not sharing or gentler use of proprietary data, I think, will become more and more common. Guys, I'm curious, trend or two that you see in the next little bit of time here in biotech and AI.
I'm happy to go. It's a very broad question, and I feel like it would be hard to keep a short answer here, but I'll also do two, only two. Okay. But picking up on, I think, what Brandon was saying, in general, I think what's really exciting about LLMs and these language models, as you said, is being able to give people the ways to automate and structure the syntax of what they're doing and automatically writing, and kind of giving them leverage on not just going faster, but also being able to layer over pieces of the process of trying to write code or trying to do data entry that they shouldn't have to care about. For us, as more of a developer platform for integrating instruments and apps, I think one of the things that we try very hard to do in many ways, but including AI, is trying to figure out how can we lower the bar to coding from software engineers down to data scientists, now even down to scientists. And the fundamental thing is everyone knows the business logic if they sit down and think about it that they want to achieve. And that in and of itself can be a little bit of an organizational change, to think in terms of what do you want to automate, what do you want to get the business logic towards. But when it comes to expressing that, every STEM degree these days has CS 101 in its curriculum somewhere. That's something everyone knows to do. And many people can write a little bit of Python in some form, or write an Excel macro or something. But the thing that always is difficult for them is figuring out, okay, where do I write that? How do I set up the context? How do I actually connect to my stuff and get it there? And that's where things like LLM, like GPT approaches for saying, hey, here's the GPT like connection to an API, or here's a GPT setup that will, for us, frame out the particular pipeline of steps that you need to do and frame out the function that you need to write to get this done. And then you write the business logic. You can say, here's how I do my curve fit. That's a statistical business logic thing. But if that's all you have to do, then the bar is lowered so much and the frustration is lowered. And so you truly can start to get a little bit closer to scientists who can code. The other one that I think we're really excited about is what I would kind of call the convergence of data structure and quality and AI, where looking at things like GXP and compliance processes and QA and QC, those things thrive on having structured data and lots of data as well. And traditionally, when there's not much that you can do with that structured data other than run it through QC or compliance, and getting more structured data means more data entry for scientists. It's unfortunate because then it means as your process scales up, the data friction also scales up. As your process scales up, you're requiring scientists and technicians to do more and more and more data entry to fill out all the metadata, fill out all their data, attach 10 files now. And then that feeds the QC team, and that can make sure that you're getting the data you need to track process parameters and so on. But now through greater automation, the automation itself, which is pulled through not just by saving scientists time, but the AI that you can do on that data, you sort of invert that curve. You change it to saying, okay, now as I scale up, I can do more automation. And the validation teams, the QC teams, they can still get everything they need. They get more now because there's more context and data than ever. But scientists also are now spending less time doing data entry. And so suddenly these teams are aligned. And that's really interesting to me because I feel like that's somewhat similar to the change going from CSV to CSA world that the FDA has been pushing towards, kind of a general greater awareness and tangibility of the business side in the validation process. I feel like this just takes it to the extreme. Now you're saying, hey, it's a virtuous cycle. The more you validate your systems, the more you get online, the more you get automated, the less human in loop discretion and risk there is. Your business moves faster now. It's not just slowing down to meet regulatory requirements. So I think we're pretty fascinated with that. And generally, the synchronization between people validating their businesses and scaling up and deploying AI on the data that you get. Like, what can you do with validation beyond just make sure that your process is stable for GXP? There's a lot of business acceleration too in that.
Maybe a candidate for next time, the tension between human in the loop and human fallible decision makers versus technology also fallible would be fun to riff on, but probably we don't have time for it today. Emerson, curious on your take on some trends that you see coming down the pike here in the near term.
I see, I'll keep mine to two as well. I see one of the most interesting to me is the use of LLM-like models to conversationally reduce friction, both in terms of building out data models, and as you said, Nathan, also building out pipelines and data analysis in a low-code or no-code manner, where you're really putting agency for analysis in the hands of scientists rather than having them have to try to explain to a data scientist and a lot of back and forth there. That back and forth can be really accelerated by a conversation with a large language model, so that you might be going to a data scientist with a question instead of like, hey, help me find the data to see if these genes are implicated in this particular compound's method of action, to saying like, hey, looking at my data, I've been able to say that like in 50% of cases, this gene is upregulated when this compound is active. Let's dig into that more deeply. So the value you're getting by the time you're getting to an interaction with a data scientist is going to be much higher. I think also, and in terms of reducing friction, things like allowing you to label very flexible structure on top of unstructured data in an automated way is going to be really impactful, not only for immediate term solutions like getting the data you want today out of unstructured data, but also as your interests evolve, going back to that 30-year corpus of data you might have and asking new questions as the science and your understanding of what's interesting changes. And if you're looking at some of the really large companies, they might have data corpuses going back 50 or 75 or 100 years, where a lot of that older data is maybe in really poorly captured scans and things of that nature, where we're starting to get to a point where it's reasonable to pull all of that data in and ask questions of that in a very interesting way and put structure on top of that in an automated fashion that we simply couldn't before. And the other big area of impact that I see on the horizon is domain-specific models that are LLM models or LLM in scale, but targeted to very specific problems. I think AlphaFold is a really great example of that. I think we'll also start to see more of those sorts of models that are looking at large corpuses of, say, human genomes, where there's a lot of information that things like genome-wide association studies have not been really good at linking up specific genetic variations with disease phenotypes, but AI across like hundreds of thousands of genome samples, which is starting to become something that we could easily do, or millions of genome samples may reveal associations where you might have like a concert of 50 different genes contributing to a heritable disease that's not linked to a single disease. So being able to figure out those associations and develop targets in a more effective way with large domain-specific models, I think is going to be an area that's going to accelerate rapidly.
Awesome. I want to make sure we have a little bit for some questions here. The first one, we are a smaller biotech startup, so resources are quite limited. What are some possibilities for us to effectively integrate AI into our R&D process? I would take one piece of this and then curious what you guys think here. One of the things that I think is important to think about any workflow change or system improvement is the sort of investment in structure versus output, right? And what I mean here is it's really easy to be like us and what army to do all this work, right? And this math works when if you're taking, say, 2 hours to spend on preparing the data for ingestion by the data science team, and this is actually saving you more than 2 hours in your workflow, you've sort of threaded this needle. So I think there's a lot of reticence to spend time working on making sure things have metadata or are tagged properly, or actually stopping to think, do we have all of the data connected here? Is it in a place where we can look at it all at the same time or export it all to the same place? But then not following that saving loop back to realizing that it isn't actually a net increase of time. It's a net decrease of time. And so even for small companies, this is, you might have one scientist at the bench. And if this math holds true, they're doing more science. I think this is the highest order ROI is, am I doing more or better science? And I think you can get this, you can put a dent in this almost immediately if you push through that first, oh God, I'm adding stuff to do. It also taking other stuff away or increasing the quality later. We see stats like 54% of science isn't repeatable and verifiable. So these are experiments that you're doing, you're duplicating, or you're having to redo that you don't. Each one of those that you run is time for this pool of work. And we believe that actually this is a net decrease in time from the scientist or a net increase in science, depending which side of the equation you're looking at.
I guess I can dive in next on this one. I would say that at an early stage where resources are very constrained, obviously your immediate goal is to generate outcomes that are going to drive further funding, right? And at that stage, there's often a focus on the outcomes and not on the data, because the outcomes are what's going to drive that next tranche of funding, whether it's a grant or next round of VC funding. Mm-hmm. And at that stage, I think it's very easy to leave data by the wayside. And there are a lot of off-the-shelf AI tools or AI-enabled tools that can really reduce the friction, as you were talking about, Brendan, for all elements of the research process. So your scientists are doing more science at the bench, and that's really ultimately going to improve your outcomes. There is that initial fear like, oh, we're adding all of this extra work, but I would encourage people that are operating small biotechs to look at what is available off the shelf to make it easier to leverage the data that you have, make it easier to leverage public data, whether that's literature mining or leveraging public data sets that are useful for your research to do in silico analysis, and also to leverage tools that make it easier to do analysis on your data. There are a lot of interesting LLM-based startups that are coming onto the scene right now that allow things like conversational analysis that would traditionally have taken like a data scientist sitting down with something like Jupyter Notebook, where now you can, as a bench scientist, sit down with a conversational interface and it will generate that Jupyter Notebook code that you can run repeatably. So look at what's available off the shelf and look at your processes and think of AI as a force multiplier that will allow your scientists to do more science rather than thinking of it as I'm going to build a model today.
So I'm going to bridge this into one of the other questions, Nathan, because it's very similar, and I think you and us at SciNote have a lot of thoughts about workflow. So very similar question, but this one is couched in workflow. How do you see the integration of AI impacting traditional research workflows? Following that, any new skills research scientists need to acquire to work with AI in their workflows. So I'd like to break this, and I'll talk about the first one real quick, and then pass tools to you if you're up for it, Nathan. I think there's two pieces here that are really important. If you're building tooling, we believe if you're building tooling for a professional user, that you need to be trying to insert the tool into the workflow instead of giving them new workflows. So from we have a bias towards the ELN and actually being on the bench. Think of all of the pieces of paper that are printed for SOPs or taped next to a machine for the instructions of the machine, or how to output this manually into a system like ours. How many places, even the ELN itself, taking away the notebook that we all used out of the mix. And so part of this for us is sort of almost fanatical pursuit of eliminating the paper at all, because this is places to leave the workflow. So if we do this right, you stay in the workflow, and this is sort of the first piece. Done right, this shouldn't be painful. And our proxy for this to think about as the business unit is, when you're looking at a new piece of software, do you feel like the what I call app load on a user is going up or down? So they already have too many pieces of technology to use, and the context switching between those apps is another place that the data or the context can fall out. So if you can offer somebody a digital solution that wraps more than one other source of solution, so let's say that Ganymede and SciNote join forces, and you now have machine data automatically in the ELN. We have some things from your own machines and the data entry from the scientists themselves, and also a LIMS, either ours or someone else's, piped together. You now have one application that the scientist is using instead of 4. So we have sort of N-3 pieces of technology. This is the stuff that soothes this workflow pain. And if you have a solution where adding an ELN, adding another LIMS, adding a piece of analysis is N+1 pieces of technology, this is where you're going to fight harder and harder and harder organizationally to get people to use it at all. You're not going to get the ROI if people aren't using it. So these levers pair really, really closely together. And obviously we have a strong opinion on how to solve part of this. But I think that we call this the 20 app problem. Are you making the 20 app problem worse, or are you making the 20 app problem better? And this could also be applied to the data sphere we're talking about. Do you have 20 sources of data, or do the scientists further down the pipeline feel like they have one? So Nathan, I want to sort of pass this to you. With that context, what skills do you think scientists have to thrive in this, or need to have to thrive as we move to more sources of data or more complicated data? Or are there new skills that they could learn to navigate these waters more effortlessly?
And I'll say, I think another framework that we like to think of this in terms of is AI is a great destination to get to, but you build up to it over time by saying, okay, I'm going to start by getting some of my workflow tracked and captured in online, and then getting to the point where you can do some basic statistics or have data visibility on it, and then you get up to AI. And so I think in that sense, scientists being able to participate in each stage of that journey, especially the earlier stages, because that's really ultimately in an R&D context where you're going to see a lot of the value, is whether you're using AI, which is a great approach for helping to accelerate workflows and get data for you and automate things, or other types of automation. Can you leverage that and operate at a high scale? I love the idea of saying, yeah, how can we keep people within the workflow or automate their workflow in place instead of adding more bells and whistles? Mm-hmm. The bells and whistles are a late stage thing, and there's profound things that you can do either in a late stage manufacturing environment or in a high throughput screening environment. But when you're in wet lab R&D, I think you have to be realistic that AI is not going to like solve all your scientific insights for you. It's a tool that can be used to accelerate the process. And that tool also overlaps a lot, especially with this notion of data structuring. And so I think for scientists, what that means is they have to be conversant in data and structure, and so they can understand, especially with this lower scale stuff, be critical of the AI and understand when, hey, it's populating some data for you automatically, or it's found a bunch of search results for you. Is this everything? Is this correct? Where did it come from? Still applying your scientific intuition. That's, I think, true for anything. When you have people making decisions off of spreadsheets where they're not looking into the model, you still have to have an intuition for who crafted the spreadsheet and why, and what's its context, and what could be the traps that it falls into. I think it's the same for AI as well. And so I think that sort of data literacy, having some experience with some sort of coding or automation, or at least seeing it so that you can think about it, is critical. And the best way to do that is to build up from the get-go. On the flip side, at the company level, I think I would be hesitant as an R&D organization to jump straight into trying to do AI for your R&D operations if you're not already, you have to walk before you run. If you're not already capturing structured data, applying best practices of having a good electronic lab notebook, a data strategy around that, being able to do some basic statistics, and then getting up to AI, that I think every step of the way is both a tooling and organization thing, but also a data literacy thing for the scientists. They have to understand how to use it, how to maximize value, so that they do stay within their workflow and they're moving faster, rather than just saying, oh, I have all these new tools and new bells and whistles, but I don't know how to use them effectively, or be critical of them, and they end up missing something, or letting bad data flow in or something like that.
Awesome. I think we're headed towards the end of our time here, so I want to make sure we took a moment to thank LabRoots for hosting the webinar, to thank Nathan and Emerson for joining us and sharing their insights with us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone in our audience for joining us and for submitting interesting questions. We did not get through all the questions we received, and I'm sure we'll receive more. Anything we didn't get through today, we will share through the contact form you provided. So make sure you complete the webinar survey to share your thoughts, your suggestions, any hanging questions, and we will follow up with those. You'll get those with the on-demand link LabRoots will send via email. We encourage you to share this email to others in case you have colleagues who may have missed today's live event. We really, really are grateful for you all to have joined us today. And one more thank you for our other panelists today. Until next time, take care, everyone. Take care of your data, and we'll see you more soon.